Hi, good afternoon. Today is Sunday, and we are going to be talking about the third week of our class. The topic is property and power, and I thought I would make a short video just because I think that this is a pretty complicated subject, and perhaps if I talk it through, uh, it will be easier for you all to understand what property and power means in the context of economics. Um, just to reiterate, we've looked at the study of economics in the first week from a personal perspective, and then in our second week we focused on scarcity, choice, and how those ideas apply to our personal decisions, regional decisions, and our business life and work. Um, but it's really important to think about economics as something that extends beyond just our day-to-day lives. Economic life has an impact that can pass from generation to generation and is certainly more important than the limited geographical space of a state or even a nation. And for that reason, I want to talk about property a little bit. And property is a catch-all term that refers to land, capital, and labor, which are economic resources also referred to in the McConnell book. And I regard these as the three main resource categories. There's also entrepreneurship, which McConnell refers to, but I don't want to focus on that right now. Um, as you all are aware, property is part of our legal framework, and as a free country with a emphasis on private property and free trade and the legal protections that we get when we buy private property or hold private property. Um, we can look at property as an asset that can be transferred at will, and that you know has a compensated value between individuals and firms. Uh, there are rights according to the owner of property, and what's interesting, of course, is that those rights are transferable, generally without cost, across generations, and for compensation and probably with cost to other legal entities. And if you think about what property represents, obviously what comes to mind is your own home. Maybe you own a farm or your family owns a farm. Maybe you are part of a larger company and you look at the tangible assets of a business. Maybe you own a company and those tangible assets are part of your bottom line. An institution, Hopkinsville Community College, the whole Kentucky technical college system can be considered property. An institution, an institutional form of property. Of course, money, stocks, shares, precious metals, livestock, natural resources, those are all forms of property. And of course, another form of property, certainly in the history of America, but still, unfortunately, in our lifetime and in our world, there is labor and servants and indentured servitude, which are also under certain economic constructions considered forms of property. And certainly this is historically true. Um, I believe, and I think many other economists do too, that the accrual of property confers power, and power creates economic opportunities that are not available to everyone. And that's really what I'm hoping we can sort of dig into in this third class. In this learning module, we will learn about demand and revenue curves and how a firm functions in competitive, monopolistic, and oligopolistic environments. Now, a couple of things that I need to clarify. A firm is any entity that produces an output. And when you think of a firm, you don't have to necessarily think of a boardroom and everybody walking around in a suit and a tie, and you don't have to necessarily think of a big building. A firm can be any entity. It can be a group of cooperative workers. It can be a household with a small business. Anyone who is an active participant in the marketplace, for the sake of this discussion, we will consider a firm. Then I want to specifically just reference competitive, monopolistic, and oligopolistic environments. A competitive environment is one where there are many entrants, many participants, and a very low barrier to entry. A monopoly is there's only one player, and there's a very high obstacle to jump through to get into that industry. And then oligopolistic environments are groups of firms that act competitively, but that still have a set of common interests. And I will detail that as we go on. As far as the McConnell book goes, the discussion that we're having today really addresses the following chapters. It kind of refers back to chapter 3, specifically with the demand curve and how the demand curve is constructed. But then it jumps ahead to chapter 10, where we talk about marginal revenue, marginal cost, and then to chapter 12, chapter 14, and chapter 20. I'm not asking you to read all of those chapters and to understand all of those chapters this week. I am asking you to follow the guidelines in the lesson plan, to look at the tables from the different chapters. And you may feel like you're being jumped around a little bit, but because we're talking about demand and revenue and not the cost of production, we've jumped ahead a little bit. And next week when we talk about other topics, we will go back to cost and supply and issues of production relevant to the firm. So I'm going to jump on to the next part of my week 3 lesson, and that is the real meat of today's class, demand and revenue curves. You'll remember that in chapter 3, the McConnell text covers the concept of the demand curve. It's always a downward sloping curve that illustrates the consumer law of demand. And what that means is that, you've always got quantity along the bottom. So the more quantity you have access to, the more the price declines. It's that simple. And for those of you who are maybe a little bit more adept with mathematical techniques, you'll be able to see that downward slope is on a horizontal axis, and that the vertical axis, that's where the price is. Quantity, the horizontal axis, determines price, the vertical axis. And that's always expressed as y, which is the vertical axis, is a function of x. Now, if you're the holder of property, if you're a firm, that demand curve behaves differently because the market for your output sets the price of what you have to sell. And in a competitive market, each firm offers a very small quantity of the total industry output of any given resource. So if you think about it, let's say you're a farmer producing melons. A melon is pretty much a melon. Everybody has, there's the very difficult to differentiate between melon producers. So the consumer is not going to think about differentiation. The consumer is just going to pick a melon, and that is going to dictate the price. Because there are so many producers of melons, um, the individual producer, the individual firm can't manipulate the price very much. It can't really, you know, wiggle. There's not a lot of wiggle room, to call it that. And if you need an illustration of that, you can see that in figure 10.1 on page 205 of the Makama book. The bottom line for this idea is that whichever the quantity of a given output, the price will always be constant. Now, if you take the other extreme, which is a monopoly, where one firm owns the unique form of output, that is where the firm is what we call the sole industry participant. And there, the price is determined by the firm. And you know, a monopolist, when we talk about monopolists, we often think of people who are able to, you know, control a price. And you might think of a very famous story by that came out a few years ago, where a young guy bought a type of medicine that had gone off patent, and that this medicine had then he put a patent back on the medicine, you know, staked his protections onto it, and then I think he raised the price by nearly 125%, making a $7 pill a, you know, a $700 pill. It was later also brought into court, and he suffered the consequences of that kind of price manipulation. And actually, that's an interesting story, because that also really shows you that monopoly is not a safe place to be. You know, there are two things that happen in monopoly. First of all, the monopolist, to make his market grow, and that's really what we're talking about here, he has to keep lowering the price. Because if he's the only one with a resource or an output, then the only way that he could get more people to buy his resource and output is to lower the price. Peripherally, the story I just told you about the medicine, the monopolist is also very quick to be under scrutiny, because of that implicit ability to manipulate price. And we'll come to that in another week. So what I would like to emphasize is that pure competition and monopoly are theoretical market conditions, and they're used to help illustrate an economic theory. In reality, the form of market condition that we encounter almost every day is either an oligopoly or monopolistic competition. For the sake of brevity, I will focus on oligopoly, because that is connected to a very clear type of graph that is complicated but fairly simple to explain. But what does an oligopoly mean? An oligopoly is for example, if you're a farmer, it's likely that your agricultural machinery is going to be made by either John Deere, New Holland, Case, Kubota, or Mahindra. And there's not a lot of other players in the agricultural machinery business, certainly not in America. And in Europe and in Asia, this is true as well. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. Other manufacturers of agricultural machinery, they face such significant barriers to entry that the dominant players don't have to be collusive, but they are certainly aware of one another's behaviors, and they form, if not a cartel, they form a group, and an industry standard might develop. So simply put, competition exists, but it's not pure competition. Um, because oligopoly is a real world example, and real world examples don't neatly fit into a mathematical formula or a graph, there is a description, there is a way to illustrate oligopoly, and you can find that figure 14.2 on page 273 of McConnell. But the way to think of it is that there are two kind of conditions that an oligopolist has. There's one demand curve, which is a straight downward sloping curve like the monopolist, but it's so unlikely because it's predicated on the idea that if one of the rivals within an oligopoly lowers the price, that no one else within that oligopoly will respond. Now, I think we can all intuit that that's very unlikely. The minute John Deere puts something on sale, it's pretty likely that New Holland is going to put a similar thing on sale. So what really happens is that the demand curve of an oligopoly is kinked. So you have a certain price, and as that quantity of goods sold increases, that price falls at, say, a regular slope. But then at one point, one of the players comes in and says, well, wait, I'm going to lower the price. And then what happens is that demand curve suddenly kinks, like a sudden kink. It's like it's not a curve, but a kink. And then the price drops precipitously while the quantity demanded actually slows down a little bit. Now, the way to construct that graph, you might remember in your first week you had to make a graph where I asked you to do a budget line for $15 and a budget line for $30. And those of you who got it right did the budget line for the $15 on the same graph as the budget line for $30. Here, you're doing exactly that. You're doing one slope of quantity and price at one angle, and then you're doing the second slope and you're tacking the two together. And what this represents is it's really just two linear equations that are tacked together on the same graph. Now, for firms, the quantity demanded is the same as the quantity sold, and what is sold generates revenue. And just as price is a function of quantity for the consumer, revenue is a function of sales for the firm. So in both cases, Y is a function of X, and it's always true that Y is a function of X. Total revenue is important, which is that constantly increasing line, not a negative slope, but a positive slope. So if you have 1 unit, then you have 1 unit sold, then you have price 1. If you have 2 units sold, then you have price 2. 3 units sold, price 3. And each price, as you go up that slope, increases because you've sold more units. It's very intuitive. Every company, of course, wants to know how much they've sold. But what's really interesting for a company is what is called marginal revenue. And that's a key concept for almost all economic decisions because it represents the extra revenue gain from selling one additional unit of output. Simply put, marginal revenue tells the firm what each additional unit is adding to the bottom line. So because it's so important, marginal revenue is very often written by economists, and in your notes for lesson 3, the section called demand and revenue curves, you can see what that looks like. And, formulas, I think, always look very scary, and it's always sort of like, oh, well, what's the formula? And I have to memorize this formula. And I think economists, for some reason or another, we have this habit of always trying to come up with formulas that are very sort of insidery. We don't, if you're an outsider and you're not an economist, then you're looking at something, you're going, what is this supposed to mean? But just so that it's simple, marginal revenue is equal to the change in total revenue over the change in quantity. And when I say over, I mean divided by. So marginal revenue equals the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. Now, underneath that, I put in the notes a mathematical formula, which looks really complicated, but it really isn't. What it just means, it's basically a way of saying exactly what I just explained, but where all of the terms are uniform. And the idea, of course, of mathematics is that you want to be able to reduce everything to one term. So for those of you who are interested, please study it. And if you have questions about it, please ask. I'll be happy to try to explain it to you. I'm going to explain it anyway. So delta y, which we just explained, is the change. Delta means change. Delta y is the change in y divided by the change in x. And that is exactly what the marginal revenue is. In a mathematical formula, you want everything to be consistent, so you don't want to introduce terms like marginal revenue or total revenue or quantity that isn't specific to mathematical logic. So you write delta y over delta x equals the function of x in its original state plus x, the change in x, minus the function of x in its original state divided by the delta of x. So that little division sign separates the function of x plus delta x minus f of x divided by delta x. Easier to read than it is to explain. I hope I'm not confusing you. If you spend some time with the McConnell book, there are helpful charts, and especially in chapter 14, you can see how these tables are made, and they give examples. And you should just try plugging in the numbers. Plug it in to the numbers and see what the results are. And it's like a computer. It's you just plug it in, and the right answer will always pop out if you do the order of operations correctly. And you probably remember from elementary school and junior high school and high school, the order of operations is super important. So just a reminder, what goes on in the parentheses has to happen before what goes on outside of the parentheses. If you need a refresher on that, please take a look at the any math website will tell you order of operations. The last part of this discussion is, there are advantages and consequences to these different forms of market behavior. I've spent some time on the math and the graphs because they're necessary for you to be able to illustrate what happens in the interaction of quantities of output, quantities sold, prices paid, revenues made. And there are advantages and consequences found in all of the market models. And that's really what we're really interested, that's what we're interested in. So pure competition is something without barriers. I mean, it's very easy to get into. The participant needs merely the necessary skills to participate in the industry. And as an example, we can go back to the melon example. Agriculture is often cited as an example of pure competition because given land and a willingness to labor, the participant may produce a crop and bring that crop to market. As I said earlier, the participant is unable to manipulate the price of a crop because there are so many producers, and the industry they're all vying to sell a standardized crop. Pure monopoly, to reiterate, it seems like a very attractive thing to get into because the participant is unique and therefore has an ability to make a set price. But you have to remember, the only way that a monopolist can grow is by lowering the price. So you have to lower. It's like the paywall. If you want access to an internet website, when that internet website is starting up, they very often try to put up a paywall. But over time, they find that no one's willing to pay that, so they have to lower the price if they want to grow the market. And then, of course, what happens is that no one who has paid in the earlier iteration of the company's presentation to the marketplace, nobody's going to pay, so you lose revenue that way too. I think a logical outcome of a monopolist's desire for growth is that the unique product must at some point become so cheap as to be, well, almost free. And then you have to question, what is the value of something free to the consumer? This touches on topics that we will come into in the coming weeks, but it's a taste of things to come. I think it's really helpful to read table 12.1, where revenue and cost data of a pure monopolist is explained, and that's on page 238. As I said earlier, both of these, both competition and monopoly, it's a construct, and it tries to help simplify an economic concept which is difficult because real-world examples are neither pure in the competitive sense nor pure in the monopolist sense. And we find ourselves in that space where oligopoly dictates what we buy, it dictates what we have access to, and I think in a way this is normal. The oligopolist participant is able to leverage considerable market share because he has created barriers to entry that allow the oligopolist to, he or she, that allow the oligopolist to examine price controls, let's say, and then on the weaker side of oligopoly, where you have what you call competitive monopolies, the barriers to entry are even lower. And I see this as being the place where the entrepreneur is able to find her or his place in the sun. The momentary gaps of output and pricing allow a nimble and adaptive entrepreneur to take full advantage of small bits of leverage that can occur on a monthly basis, they can occur on a yearly basis. On the downside, of course, small business is a business that is a business model that is short-lived. The average small business in the United States only lasts for 9 years. And I think that speaks volumes about how hard it is to stay competitive in a free marketplace. So that's it for today. You also have a test which will be due on Wednesday, and there is no homework for this week because of the test. Thank you, and we will see you down the road.